All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for stopping in here. Let me just see here, make sure everything's working all right. We're starting up a couple minutes early to make sure that everything is ship shape. You're not seeing it? Are you hearing me? Okay, cool. This is why we started a couple minutes early. All right. It says I'm currently streaming. I gotcha. Start virtual camera. There we go. It's backwards. Is it showing backwards for you? It's reversed for me. Like paper time machines is. That's a little bizarre. Well, if it works for you, then that should be fine. Cool. All right. Well, good morning, folks. A little small. Okay. All right. Fantastic. Okay. Well, in any case, good morning, folks. We're just getting a little bit set up here right before the stream starts. Get settled in. Hi, everyone. Thank you for stopping in to the Gen Con Paper Time Machines stream. We are here with Volko this morning, and we'll be getting going here in just a moment. Just getting our small technical glitches out of the way before we get taken off here. Can you hear me on there? Yep. Feel free to ask questions at any point in time during the stream. We are happy to make sure that those questions are relayed properly. No issues with that at all. Okay. It is 9 a.m. and so let us kick this bad boy off. Hi, everyone. Thank you for stopping into the Paper Time Machines Talk. I am Jack Trumbull with the Let's Talk About Wargames podcast. With me this morning is my intrepid co-host, Joe Fonseca, with the Let's Talk About Wargames podcast. Hi, Joe. And with us here today is our beloved board game designer, Volko Ruhnke. Good morning, sir. All right. So, thank you for stopping in, and I don't have too much of a lead up to give off to you here. We have quite a treat for you today. Everyone's favorite PowerPoint presentation, but I am so excited for this, I gotta say. Yeah, I can hear you through Discord. Sorry about that. Are we audible on the stream, Joe? Can you tell? Okay. So, Volko, you should be audible on the stream. Let me just double check real fast for you. On here, you are 100% good to go. If you can just talk for a sec, let me just double check. Okay. That's a little strange. Yeah, sorry about that. That's a little strange that it wasn't picking you up. So, if you could just give us a couple more words, please, just make sure that this is coming through, okay? Hmm. Okay. Only hearing Volko once now. You were hearing him twice? I'm not sure. It was working a moment ago. Let me just throw the stream up onto the other tool that should be working, okay? And still nothing. That's so strange. It was working fine a moment ago. Might be an OBS issue. Let me start streaming over again. Let me just restart this real fast. Sorry for the delay, everyone. It should be taking you. It says that it's taking you. Can you keep talking, please? Just keep talking so I can make sure that the audio is working. Just don't stop talking. That should do it, and we are
Okay.
back.
We're back.
Oh,
And
Video.
with video
Oh,
end.
and I can hear myself again.
Volko, can you give us some words?
sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. All right. Let me
Yeah,
just check
we're
and make sure
good to
people in
go.
the chat can hear.
I've verified we are good to go. Sorry for the delay,
There
everyone.
we go.
That was the fun of technical issues. I'll share a little fun story for you on that. Joe and I tested this thoroughly the other day to make sure it worked, and we went through everything and worked without an issue. And those fun day of issues that happen. So sorry for the wait there, everyone, but we're now good to go again.
All right, so no lives lost.
We can't see your stream at the moment, Volko, but we can see
Oh.
you in the top corner there. If you
You
want to,
cannot see my stream?
I can see you. I think that there was a little bit of loss there because we started and stopped it. So if you want to share your screen again so we can see those slides.
Back out and share my screen.
I will
Okay.
show people
Here. Stop streaming.
our little logo here in the meantime for the stream. And when you're up, I will pop us back over to it.
All right, I've tried to stream again.
All right, and we are back. We can now see the slides again. Again, everyone, sorry for the delay, but we are back here with Volko Ruhnke and us here. Let's talk about Wargames. And we are good to go.
Perfect. Take it away.
So just some brief definitional hygiene before we actually look at the games, and I'm sorry this is necessary, but I'm going to be using the kind of technical term system dynamics model and those three terms separately, and just to explain all I mean by system is that the parts are interacting to create some different or greater whole, and the interaction is not fully chaotic. There are rules for the interaction. So you really have to understand the whole thing, the system. You have to look not just at the components, but how they're affecting each other. And how they're affecting each other is in motion, is changing, and that's what I mean by the words dynamic. In other words, you can think of a system that just sits there, but in this case, not only are the pieces, the parts moving or changing in their character, even the rules might change, and so we want to model that with something that is also dynamic, a dynamic model. And all I mean by model is that we're simplifying a more complex world or reality, and we're simplifying that to examine and access certain things for a certain purpose, so a purposeful simplification. So that's how this through this framework that I want to show you some things from these games. So I thought I'd go ahead and do 3 pairs of games, one each fictional setting and a historical setting, and just show how we're looking at similar particular aspects of life, of humanity in each case. And in each case, I'm not going to be showing you a whole lot of game components. I'm certainly not going to be teaching you how to play these games, simply sampling an aspect or two of what they model. So starting with Dune, and I'm hoping that many of you have already played this game. I'm hoping that many of you are as excited as I am for the arrival of the new film in the States next month. I understand people in Europe are already watching it. I really like this board game Dune, which by the way I've played going back to the 1980s. In terms of how well it transports me into Frank Herbert's world, the desert planet of Dune or Arrakis. And so the aspect of the world of Dune and what's in the game that I'm going to chat about is military economics. So right on the cover we have the catchphrase, "The spice must flow," and as you probably know, spice is the substance that only is found on the planet Dune that enables, in this interstellar civilization, enables space travel, because Spice enables the navigators to see ahead enough to safely navigate without computers that are outlawed from star to star. And so spice is the treasure found on Dune, and it is money. So in the game, you're playing up to 6 factions, and they're all vying across the surface of the planet to control the planet because, as you will know from the book, if you can control the surface of Arrakis, Dune, the desert, where the spice comes up, you are the one who can harvest the spice. And if you control the spice, you control space. You control space travel, and thus ultimately this interstellar empire. And so what I'm showing you in the little box at left with that text is a simple model that's in the book and in the game, of course. And then below that, a slightly different version showing the relationships at the strategic level. That if you can control the desert of Arrakis, you can harvest the spice, and you can use the spice to pay your troops, which in turn control the desert. So we have a little loop picture, and that's a simple model, just to show that everything you're looking at here, each of these 3, including the picture of the game, is a model. So I want to give you a little bit more detail of how the game examines the flow of spice, and I'm going to do it with a picture that I'm going to build up slowly, since we don't have time to actually play the game together. But I'm going to try and represent the relationships in the game as they concern the flow of spice. So here we have 5 of the possible 6 factions. I've simplified this a bit down to these 5, and they're all vying for control of the planet Dune. And so if we start with the emperor at the upper right, well, emperor's at the top of the hierarchical pyramid. It's good to be the emperor, and something you have the power to do if you're the emperor is to tax commerce. So when somebody purchases weapons using spice, which is the money, in order to fight for Dune, the proceeds of that flow to the emperor. So what we're seeing here is that these brown arrows are the relationship with regard to the flow of spice. Spice flows from the other factions to the emperor whenever people buy weapons. In the game, they're called treachery cards. There are other things in there, but basically the means whereby they can fight. At the same time, the guild, which is
Oh man, it happened again.
Did you lose my voice again? Am I on, or?
Sorry, Jack. Looks like Scream froze.
No, I think that's just you.
Oh.
Are we
I'm not a very
A-okay?
good monitor, then am I? Okay.
Yeah, I think we're good to go. Sorry about that.
Good to go? No worries. All right. So looking next at the spacing guild, the guild is who controls the space travel by being able to navigate. And so anybody who wants to bring troops to the surface of the planet, to Dune, has to pay spice in the game to the guild in order to add to their troops on the planet trying to fight for control of Arrakis. So we're seeing here some different relationships among the different factions. And where does this spice come from? Well, in the game, spice comes from, as in the book, spice blows, which is that some spice has come up that's created by the worms under the sand, and every once in a while it comes to the surface like a geyser, and it's lying out on the desert, and you have to go collect it, the way here we're showing the Fremen, who live in the desert, going and collecting some spice. The other factions are doing that too, all in competition with one another to obtain the means, the resources, the spice to bring in the troops and buy the weapons and fight each other. Atreides and Harkonnen have to go out and get the spice as well. They don't live in the desert. They start out in the cities of Arrakeen and Carthage, but that gives them some ornithopters, which are the airborne vehicles that get them out there quickly and enable them to bring more spice back home from the desert before the sandworms show up and interrupt the activities. or a storm blows over the spice blow and sweeps everything away, except the Fremen, who have some advantages in foreseeing or controlling the storms, surviving them because they're desert dwellers, and of course can control the worms and don't have to worry about that at all. So we're starting to see in this system advantages and disadvantages that each of the factions have in the flow of spice that all is supporting and caused by their war for the planet. We have finally another detail, which is when they fight, they're spending spice. So you've got an inflow and an outflow of the resources. And what's important is the ability to collect these resources to feed your effort. So it's not just the tactics and the alliances, but the economics of the situation that are going to help determine the outcome of the battle. Okay, so I very quickly put together this diagram and walked you through it. And if we step back and look at it, and if you have not played the game, the chances are that this is going to be very hard to take in all of this spaghetti and really understand what's going on. And that might be true even if you have played the game. If you just suddenly look at this and say, well, what do I take away from this? It's just an almost overwhelming number of bits and pieces in this diagram. And I point that out because I want to contrast it with having played the game in terms of the power of revealing these systems to us that board games have. If you've played Dune, everything that's up on this screen, you already know. In fact, you know a lot more because just to fit everything on this loop diagram, this systems model on the screen, I've had to simplify out a lot. Not even all the factions are here. Not everything that you'd use spice for is here. And this is only about the flow of spice. There's plenty of other things going on in the game as well. So it's just an illustration of how accessible a complex model is by playing a board game, as opposed to just about any other way that someone would have to describe for you how this world works. So returning to the game itself, we can see what this looks like in action. So if you look at the shot of play on the left, you will see that there are a couple of markers of spice. Those are the 5s. They've appeared out in the desert. That's a spice blow. And 2 factions troops, in this case, I think it's the Harkonnen and the Fremen, have shown up to battle to collect it up. In the background, the Harkonnen and the Atreides are sitting on their cities. That's what gives them the ornithopters to be able to collect the spice very well. And all the factions are battling it out, not just to control the strongholds that will ultimately control the planet and win the game, but to control the terrain that produces the resources for the military conflict. And so that's an important and real principle is you have to control whatever it is on the land or on the surface that gives you the economic wherewithal to pursue your military campaign. All right, so let's look at a very similar case in history. And in this case, it's ancient history and what we can glean of the Roman conquest of Gaul from Caesar's Gallic War, so a classical memoir that tells us most of what we think we know about the Roman conquest of Gaul by Julius Caesar in the 50s BC. And we can see in the pages of this book, of this history, a very similar kind of relationships. That what Caesar is doing is he's running around Gaul with his legions, trying to control enough of the tribes of Gaul to be able to obtain the food to feed his legions. So if you read the book, The Gallic War by Caesar, he's frequently worrying about getting the grain and cattle to feed his legions, worried about whether his Gallic tribal allies are delivering the corn, as the Oxford translation puts it, because if he can control the supply of grain, he can feed his legions and if he can feed his legions, he can control the tribal allies to continue to control the harvest of grain, and he has conquered Gaul. So very similar military economics to what Dune the game and Dune by Frank Herbert shows us. And I just want to show you a little bit about how that model plays out in my co-design, Falling Sky, which is about Caesar trying to subdue the Gallic tribes in Rome. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I realize that it's hard to take in these loopy diagrams, but to kind of give you a sense by comparing what's different and what's the same, because of course this world is different than that of Dune. The games are different. So there are similarities and differences that to me, as I play different games, whether historical or fictional, I just find interesting. So here are factions in Gaul as Caesar is arriving with his legions. And what we see are several Gallic factions, the kind of warthog-looking symbol there, and Germanic tribes in the east. And they have, they're all confederations. They have lots of allies, and those allies are tribes, individual tribes allied to a lead people or a lead tribe in a confederation. And in the game, they're represented by these colored discs. And at start, we see a lot of back and forth happening here between two of these factions, the Averni and the Aedui in the west. And the reason that that's going on is because these are both ethnically similar confederations, different oligarchies who are trying to overcome the other in terms of recruiting more tribal allies into their own confederation. So what these arrows mean here is not the flow of resources, but the flow of tribal allies. Each of these is taking the allies away from the other. As the legions arrive, the new ingredient they put in is they are very effective militarily, and through battle, the legions are able to subdue tribes, basically force them out of warfare and to, in effect, bow to Rome, if you will, or to Caesar. And so these legions are draining away allied tribes from the various factions. And these subdued tribes, if the Romans can control them with enough legions to dominate an area, they can actually seize resources from them, including dispersing them and is in effect enslaving as many of them as they can round up and selling those enslaved Gauls back in the Roman Republic to raise even more resources to fund the conquest of Gaul. So that's an important aspect of what Caesar and the Romans are doing here in Gaul in the 50s BC. And so here again, this fat brown arrow from subdued tribes down to the Romans, that's resources. It's grain, it's livestock, and it's also enslaved Gauls and the silver that they produce to pay the legions to keep doing all this. So that's sort of a big new element that Caesar is introducing to the military economy here. But there's, of course, again, a drain on resources as the different factions are executing their commands to fight and rally more allies to their cause and so forth. That costs resources, and the game tracks that. Every command you take costs some resources. And what I'm trying to show with this very fat brown arrow in the lower right is that the Romans' costs are higher. Legions are very effective militarily. They're also expensive relative to the tribal war bands that the Gauls and the Germans are fielding. And so even this ability by the Romans to subdue tribes and seize their resources is not quite enough generally to run the Roman war machine. And so we get to probably the most important relationship in the game and the most important relationship in the history of Caesar's Gallic War. And that is between the Aedui Confederation at the lower left and the Romans. What's happening here is that the Aedui happen to live along the main trade routes between Gaul and Rome. And therefore, they're able to garner a lot of resources from that trade. And if the Romans, Caesar supports that by providing the supply line into the Roman Republic, the trade of the Aedui becomes even more lucrative and rewarding. And so the Aedui have a reason to transfer some of those resources back to the Romans, not only to get the support for the trade route itself, but because the Aedui are in competition with a potentially stronger Averni Gallic confederation. And the Aedui want the Romans to use their legions to squash the Averni allies so that the Aedui ultimately can take over. Now, this is a pivotal and dynamic relationship because in the end, only one player wins. That is to say, either the Aedui inherit Gaul or the Romans do. So at a certain point, this mutually beneficial economic relationship at the bottom of the screen here probably will fall apart. And historically, in 52 BC, indeed, the Aedui changed sides, allied with the Averni and the Belgi, and everyone fought Rome together. And we got the massive siege of Alegia, which of course Caesar did win in the end. So a lot of stuff again going on this screen, but if you play Falling Sky, all of this will become second nature because it's built into the fabric of the gameplay, and you don't have to take in all these little arrows and labels. You will know the dynamics of the system, and you'll know it better than this kind of drawing can show you, because this is about system dynamics, meaning change in allies and resources among these factions. But this picture is not a dynamic model. It's a static model. It just kind of sits here and shows you these arrows. But if you play the game, you're actually operating a dynamic model of a dynamic real world history, because you're able to change it and move things and experiment and see what happens. And that's so much more powerful for understanding how these complex human affairs might play out. All right, let's go to some fantasies.
Actually, that leads to
Please.
a question I had actually for you, because just watching this, the systems here and everything kind of flowing together with these arrows. This looks like the last time I tried to teach Japanese party politics in the 20s.
Yes.
And my students had such a hard time, and I had this kind of diagram on the board trying to show them different connections and how things were working. And I'm wondering about the use of these kinds of games in, just non-military post-secondary education. And if that's something that's been talked about, or something that is part of the designs, or if people have been reaching out about using games in courses.
Excellent question and observation. So my day job, I was an intelligence analyst for about 30 years. And the last, so part of my job was trying to understand stuff like this, okay, but in the current setting. And in the last decade of my career, I was a classroom instructor. So my job was to teach other intelligence analysts how to get at problems like this, how to understand the world, which is, at its core what intelligence analysis is. And absolutely, if we were trying to get students inside complex human affairs, and complex meaning the relationships determine the nature of the whole, and the effects are wide-ranging, non-linear, surprising, and all human affairs are that way. Small inputs can have big outputs that are very hard to forecast. So to get them to understand, let's say, an expert's model or an instructor's model, a diagram like this is very opaque. It's very hard to take in. Whereas playing a game like this, once you get once you have taken in the rules and you're playing it, becomes very intuitive, as we all know. And so absolutely, we increasingly over my career used the power of tabletop games, including board games specifically, even some versions of commercial games, to teach. We use them for research and analysis as well, and so do a lot of institutions around the world. And so professional role-playing games are very widespread. So there's a lot of that for the same reason. You're modeling, you're using the role players, the players themselves and their expertise to drive that model. The U.S. Department of Defense has a sizable industry of professional war gamers that do that. Of course, we also use computer or computer-assisted simulations. What is being utilized, but I think still underutilized, is board games. That if you can put it on the table for the students, and you have enough facilitation that they don't have to be too nervous about learning the rules because you're helping them. You've got a facilitator at every table. It can be extremely powerful for letting them experiment in a simplified but purposefully, consciously simplified model of the world you're trying to take them into. And so it's funny you should mention Japanese politics. I did a training game that we used a lot of years that happened to be modeled on East European politics. And the purpose of the simulation was just to teach Americans the nature of parliamentary politics, right? And that was the learning objective. And we did that by having them play parties attempting to form coalitions, in a parliament, roughly modeled on 1990s Eastern Europe, if you will. Worked very well. And what you can then do is, as an instructor, when you've finished playing the game or as it's going on, you can invite the students to compare the game to reality, right? The students have now shared with you a framework that is a simplification of reality. Of course, not everything's in the board game. And you can ask them, well, what do you think this board game gets wrong? What is it? You've played this out. What reminds you of the real world? What's realistic? But what does it underplay, or what does it leave out? And now they're giving you back their understanding of the real world that they can compare and contrast to the model you've just shared together on a table. I find it's very, very powerful. All right.
Thank you. That sounds like exactly the kind of thing that would have helped my students.
Yeah, and you will find.
Maybe I'll try and do that next year.
Yeah, you'll find lots of examples out there of teachers and trainers doing that. It's not necessarily easy to pull off because not everybody likes board games, so and you don't want the students to become too focused on. I mean, just whenever we play a board game the first time, it's a little bit nerve-wracking because we don't know what we're doing, and we're afraid of making a dumb move or something like that. And so you do have to account for that. But if you put a facilitator, if you divide up the students at tables with several sets of the game, and you put a facilitator at each to kind of help them through and say, don't worry so much, I'll help you, you'll get the rules. Once they get over that hump, you can get a great deal of learning value out of board games, in my view. So onward into Middle Earth, and one of my favorite war games, War of the Ring. And what it says is epic battles in the lands of Middle Earth. That's what it says on the box, and it promises to cover. So the question I want to ask here relates to medieval military operations, because Tolkien's Middle Earth presents a roughly a medieval level of military technology, and in fact reflects that technology rather coherently and vividly, and so does this game. So what we want to ask ourselves is, these epic battles, what causes epic battles? What causes them in Return of the King? We have a few epic battles in the in Return of the King, well, in the entire Lord of the Rings, actually. We have a few epic battles. And how does that relate to what causes them in real life medieval military operations, military operations in medieval times? We have a little strategic model we can look at that focuses in on the role of strongholds. So strongholds are things like castles and walled cities. And because the main resource in medieval times is land, is agriculture, land is what you need to hold to have the wherewithal to muster, that is, form up armies. Those armies can besiege, can attack walled places, strongholds, and if they can take those away from the enemy, whoever controls those strongholds then inherits control of that land, which enables you later to muster more armies, and the cycle continues. So I'd like to take this right to history this time and do some hopefully simpler spaghetti diagrams than what I inflicted on you with regard to Dune and Gaul, and try to get at what makes epic battle happen in the context of the importance of strongholds. So we see here some defender strongholds on the left, an attacker stronghold on the right, and we're going to lay out a little system dynamics model of military operations in medieval times. So something that's important in terms of being able to muster an army at your stronghold is that you already control the land. So on the right, we have a would-be attacker. They're able to muster at their stronghold, that is, form an army, shown by these helmets, because they already can.
Volko, we're not seeing that one. We're still seeing the War of the Ring slide.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, so have I cut off my stream because I've advanced a couple? Let me go back to.
I think if you close out of the stream for a second and open back up, it should resync.
Let me do that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're still moving in the top corner, no problem.
Yeah,
okay.
It's catching you just fine. There we go. I see your screen fine.
Okay.
Now.
Yep.
All right. Do you see?
Yes.
The new screen now?
Yes,
all right. So what I'm
Three
showing
castles?
here. Say again?
We're seeing
three
the castles.
Very good. Yes. Right. So 3 strongholds. So some defender strongholds on the left and attacker stronghold on the right. And if it advanced now, you should see some helmets. And so what this is showing here is that the attackers on the right are able to muster their army around their castle, their stronghold, because that stronghold already controls friendly land around it. So that, which is the source of manpower and the wherewithal to muster your army. The defenders maybe catch wind of what's coming, and so they start to muster their own army at their own forward stronghold. So it's a smaller army. But they're going to try to defend themselves. So next, the attacker has to get his army to the defender's walled town or stronghold to take it over. That's the point. So there's an approach march. And now the smaller defender army has a choice. They can stand outside the gates and fight an epic battle, or they can go hide inside the walls of their stronghold, which will protect them from the stronger approaching attacker. So in this case, which would be the typical response, the defender has pulled inside their stronghold, is going to use the walls to protect them against enemy attack, and they are now besieged. Now, a problem, among others, with being besieged is you're surrounded by the attacking army. You cannot add to your forces anymore. It's too late for that. You're inside the castle or the city or whatever it is. You don't have access anymore to the land around you, that friendly land around you, that you need to muster your army. All of this plays out in Lord of the Rings, as we'll see soon. However, there's also bad news for the attacker, because they're also generally not able to add to their army, at least not where they are, because they're now far away from their own stronghold, friendly land. They're in enemy land that they don't yet control, because they don't control it until they take over that defending stronghold that they're besieging. So they're not able to muster either. And here they are. And the key to the defense is they have other strongholds behind them, as we see at the upper left. And those strongholds are able to muster a relief army. And because siege takes a long time, you're waiting for the guys inside to run out of food or to surrender. And if the guys inside, the besieged defenders, realize that a relief army is on the way, they're unlikely to surrender. So now the defenders have the time to muster an army that is large enough to take on the attacker. And that relief army is going to march over and chase off the attacker. And if the attacker says, no, we're not giving up this siege, what results is an epic battle. And so what we're seeing here is that not always, but very often in medieval history, the reason you have these giant armies clashing on the field is because it's about the strongholds. It's because one army is trying to take over a stronghold by siege, and a second army is coming to lift that siege, a relief army. And reeling back a little bit, of course, the attacker knows that the relief army is coming, typically, and so that puts pressure on them perhaps to act faster than just waiting for the siege to starve out the guys inside, and actually take the risk and cost of assaulting those castle walls or those city walls in what would be a storming of a stronghold, an epic storm, if you will. And sometimes this is what happens. There's time pressure on the guys outside to take the losses that they're going to take. Now, if you think about the scenes in Lord of the Rings outside Helm's Deep or outside Minas Tirith and the Battle of the Fields of Pelennor, this dynamic should sound very familiar to you. Here we have it in the game War of the Ring, and pretty prominent on the game map are strongholds. And in fact, victory in the game can be obtained by capturing enough of your enemy's strongholds, and that's very medieval. Capture the enemy's castles and walled towns, and you will be able to take over your objective, which is to take his land away from him. And so that's certainly happening in the game War of the Ring. As if you know the story in Return of the King, the defenders of Minas Tirith, the stronghold in the middle, are facing an attack out of Minas Morgul in Mordor on the right, and they're hoping for relief from Rohan, Edoras, and Helm's Deep to the left. And on the game board, it might look like this. We have the Minas Tirith stronghold in the center with a valiant Gondorian army there in blue, a massive Mordor army marching out of Minas Tirith on the right to besiege it, and forming up the relief army from Rohan on the left. And just to put a little bit more graphic model marcation on it, it looks like this. And this story, which is let's call it the historical sequence of events in the third book, very, very similarly can play out in the game War of the Ring. You can see this sort of thing happen quite a bit. Epic battles that have to do with potential storm, siege, and relief, all revolving around the strongholds. And if you've played the game, hopefully you recognize that dynamic very well. It is quite realistic and suggestive of many similar such sequences that happened in the history of medieval Europe. So let's look at the history of medieval Europe. This is a game of my design called Nevsky. It's the first in a series called Levy and Campaign. And instead of epic battles in Middle-earth, it's epic battles on the Baltic frontier of the 13th century. And here's a portion of the game map. You can see it also focuses on strongholds. In this case, the little shields are seats. We add the detail that different lords have seats at different strongholds, and it's at these seats that they initially muster their army. and draw the wherewithal to build that army up. Attackers and defenders as before, but we've just flipped the west-east alignment, just kind of flipped around from what it was in the War of the Ring. The Teutons on the left are attacking the Russians on the right. And the armies are shown as lords. These cylinders, the black cylinders are the attackers, the white cylinders, the defenders. And here, two Teuton lords are attacking and besieging the walled town of Pskov, and there's one Russian lord, a local army, inside and under siege. And the relief army of Russians is traveling from Novgorod on the upper right to try to lift that siege by attacking the besieging attacking army. Same basic strategic and operational models in play. Here it is with a little bit of, again, marking of what this model is doing. Very, very similar dynamic, because I'm trying here with this model to reproduce typical medieval military operations, just like those we see in the War of the Ring. And we add a few more details I won't get into, but each of those cylinders has individual units on an accompanying mat. And we have not only specialized troops and weapons, but we even have a little bit of an economic model as well, because you can see markers for coin to pay the armies, loot and provender to feed them. And so we get into some military economy as well. But here I've just focused on this particular dynamic of strongholds and armies that produce these epic battles typically. All right.
If I may ask a question about that, actually.
Yes, please.
I noticed that in War of the Ring, we mentioned this a little bit before we started going here, but in War of the Ring, the forces of Mordor and the East have replenishing troops, whereas the Gondorians and the Rohan folks, they don't have replenishing forces there, and so it kind of forces more of a focus on the attriting the enemy forces down by attempting to seize their strongholds without bloodshed in these cases, because they don't have the ability to bring back their forces. I'm curious as to Nevsky, does a similar sort of conflict come into play here if these, because in the time period, it would be difficult to replenish forces if you're going to be storming all these castles. What does that look like in this model?
Yes, no, excellent. So that's a really interesting, as we were talking about, a really interesting asymmetry in War of the Ring, and gives you a sense of how, well, I think you would put it this way yourself, that these little details, just a little rule that's pretty easy, can provide really interesting effects. And the asymmetry is because on one side you have, humans and elves that are born, and there are only so many of them. And on the other side, you have orcs that can be kind of created in pits, if you will, and almost manufactured, as well as presumably massive armies coming from the east and the south, the Easterlings and the Southrons, that, who knows how many there are that can be added in. Here in history, of course, it's humans on both sides. So it's a little bit more symmetrical. And in both cases, there are indeed sort of maximum size of forces. There are only so many resources. There are only so many vassals, your subordinates as a lord, and they only have so many troops of their own that are able to muster and collect together. So there is an absolute limit. Now, what happens here in Nevsky that's a little different, and is a detail with regard to medieval military operations in the real world, is that there's a limited time that these lords, these armies will muster. They're only committed to serve a certain amount of time, and if things are going badly, like they're starving or losing battles, they'll go home even quicker. If things are going well and you're paying them loot and silver from conquest, then they'll hang around longer. It's an important part of the game that I don't think is in War of the Ring. You're kind of, when you're mustered in War of the Ring, you're signed up for the duration. In real life medieval warfare, that wasn't the case. It wasn't really total war. The lords went home to tend to their affairs. Troops at a certain time said, well, my obligation is done and I'm going home. And so you can actually recycle your lords. You can have them go home, disband, and then if you have the right conditions, if you still have the friendly territory, the strongholds to do it, you can remuster the army fresh some months later. On the other hand, it's absolutely possible for a lord to have his army destroyed, and he's not coming back in the game. So a different dynamic, and I guess an example. Your question is an example of how much more there is to the military operations models in each of these games that transports you into that specific world. Yes, there are similarities. Similarities are seductive, we say in history. Differences decisive, and these little differences that the games include are powerful in taking you to that particular world. But it would take me all day, right? We should just play the game if we're going that far.
Yeah.
So I have, of course, just simplified and focused in on a few things that are similar.
Sure.
But that's kind of what I'm trying to illustrate, even with this particular image here, is there's a whole lot more, to discover in each of these games about the specific dynamics, the personality of that world.
Mm-hmm. Just for a time note, we are now at 10 a.m.
Okay, and so I'm hoping folks can hang out for another half hour. We did have some delays. I have one more couplet to show you, and that's Star Wars and Star Wars Rebellion, the game, and what does it tell us about the nature of what it says on the cover it is offering you. And what it says is it's offering you epic conflict between a galactic empire and a rebel alliance. So, what is the nature of this conflict? So here's an image of the game. As you can see in the game, we have a number of important planets in the galaxy, and the Imperial forces are flying around, and the rebels are defending themselves. What kind of conflict is this? What I'm going to argue is that the conflict portrayed in the films and in this game are fundamentally insurgency and counterinsurgency. Insurgency and counterinsurgency. Well, what is that? So by insurgency, I mean a strategy of armed struggle to overthrow state authority. So the rebels, of course, are the insurgents, and the empire, which is trying to sustain its authority over the galaxy, is the counterinsurgency. So this is a very common real-world military strategy that I'm sure you have taken in from the news of the last many years. So if we think about when Star Wars was made, I think the third day Star Wars was out, I waited 2 hours in line at the theater downtown in my town to go see it in 1977, May 1977. George Lucas conceived and made this film during and in the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War. Now, I don't know whether he was consciously drawing from that experience, but at that time, the U.S. in Vietnam was a very recent trauma. And for many people, including, I would think, in Hollywood, the U.S. was not the good guys looking back on that conflict at that moment. And so it's tempting to conclude that played a role in his conception of what would be going on in his fictional galaxy. So I'm going to compare Star Wars Rebellion to another co-design of mine, Fire in the Lake, which is exactly about this, insurgency in Vietnam during the U.S. effort there. And I want to basically use these two games and their systems dynamics models to talk a little bit about the nature of the dynamics of insurgency and counterinsurgency. An important principle, let's say a common phenomenon, is that the counterinsurgents have the firepower advantage. They've got the resources. They already control the state, if you will. They've got the resources to squash any insurgents that they can find. The insurgents, however, have a countervailing advantage that we call information advantage. Sure, the counterinsurgents, the state, the Galactic Empire, has a lot of firepower, but where are the insurgents? You can see all the firepower here, but where are the rebels? You can hardly see them. Where are they? Well, of course, they're at their hidden rebel bases. So the key for the counterinsurgents is to find these hidden rebel bases to be able to apply that firepower. And that relationship drives the key dynamics of the operations that take place within that strategic setting. That is guerrilla warfare for the insurgents, hit and run attacks, hiding, attritional warfare, and anti-guerrilla sweeps or searches by the counter-insurgents. So that's the little graphic model in the middle. What's happening here is big, fat, powerful counterinsurgent forces are trying to assault the hidden rebel bases, but first they have to find them. They have to search or sweep for them. And as long as the rebels can keep their bases hidden or perhaps move their forces to a new rebel base if they have to, they can launch these little raids and sabotage attacks to weaken the counterinsurgent forces over time. These dynamics are the classic dynamics of guerrilla warfare, and guerrilla warfare is the classic mode of operations within insurgency and counterinsurgency. And of course, that should all sound very familiar to you from Star Wars. So just by way of sampling, here are some of those elements in this game that, again, I'm not going to describe everything. I'm just trying to show how action cards, mission cards, objective cards, and that are used as you play the game and fight your battles as your pieces are moving across the galaxy on the game board, all vividly give you these same dynamics. The Empire is searching for the hidden rebel base. It needs to find it to win. If it manages to encounter some rebels, it's usually strong enough for its forces to assault those rebels. It's hoping to bring a powerful enough force, possibly including the Death Star, to bear on where the rebel base is once it finds it. The rebels, meanwhile, are getting ready to defend that base. Sooner or later, the Empire is going to arrive. But mainly, they're using the fact that the base is hidden, that they can move their fleets around the map in a secret and hidden way to launch more or less hit and run attacks, sabotaging the Empire's ability to build up its forces and gain reputation for the rebels to win the game before their base is discovered and destroyed. And in that regard, just to point out one mechanic in this game, if you haven't played it, that is tremendously clever design and effective in bringing across this search for the bases, are these probe cards in the middle. What happens in the game is there's a deck of cards that has all the planets except the galactic capital. There's a card for each planet. And in the beginning of the game, in addition to some planets that begin loyal to one side or the other, the rebel player is choosing where to hide their base. And the rebel player takes that card out of the probe deck. And over the course of the game, the Imperial player is searching, drawing small numbers of the remaining probe cards out of the deck. So the Galactic Empire player, the counterinsurgent, is able to narrow down through its probes, narrow down where the rebel base might be. But the Galactic player doesn't really know until the rebel player doesn't really know until the end how much and what does the Galactic Empire know about where its base might be. Very, very simple in execution, much harder for me to explain than to play it, and really gives you this core dynamic of search for the hidden rebel base. Really gives you the dynamics of that very effectively. Really love that. And then just to show some more aspects of this, the the Galactic Empire is trying to build up its forces to make sure it has that firepower advantage. A lot of it's that when it finds the rebels, of course, it's going to be launching a big attack, and the rebels are worried about should they defend their base or should they evacuate it and form another. Okay, some similar dynamics, but with very different mechanics in Fire in the Lake. The map, of course, is not the galaxy, it's South Vietnam.
Looks like it's still showing a rebellion there on the screen.
Okay, has it caught up or should I reset?
I think go ahead and give a quick reset. It should catch up just fine.
Roger.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Are we looking at South Vietnam?
Sure are.
All right, very good. So this will be rather brief, but just to give you a taste of a different way that Fire in the Lake looks at finding rebel bases in Vietnam, which is indeed something that the counterinsurgents there, the U.S. included, were doing. So in this case, there are dedicated commands, actions that the U.S. and the South Vietnamese army are using to sweep and to assault. And the way it works here is that a sweep moves U.S. troops, represented by these olive green cubes, into or within an area, and those are going to reveal hidden guerrillas. So the red pieces here are the rebels, if you will, the communists. The large discs are their bases, and the smaller octagonal pieces are the guerrillas. And if they're showing a symbol, if they're showing the gold star, they've been exposed. They are now vulnerable to being assaulted. But as long as they're hidden, they can't be attacked by the US, and they also hide any base that's with them. So what's happened in this picture is that 4 US units have done a sweep into Quang Duc province. They're looking for these guerrillas, the red pieces. The 4 cubes in this part of in this jungle terrain exposes 2 of the guerrillas that they can now attack with an assault action. But they can't yet attack the base because there's a 3rd guerrilla that is still hidden. That means that they can't find the base either. In other words, the mechanic is the base is only exposed if any guerrillas with it are exposed. So that's a very different way of looking at and modeling hidden bases, but it works similarly to show this same dynamic of insurgency and counterinsurgency. Meanwhile, of course, the guerrillas are doing their attacks, and instead of sabotage, it's terror to influence the population, and they're going to try to get away with that as long as they can and don't have to worry about hiding their base that's become exposed. So one other central aspect of insurgency and counterinsurgency I'll show you even more briefly, because it's so important to understanding the real life insurgency and counterinsurgency strategies, and also shows up very prominently in these games. And that's the answer to the question, how does each side counter the advantage of the other? How do the counterinsurgents obtain information? And how do the insurgents build up their firepower? And the answer to that question is the loyalty of the population. And for this reason, in counterinsurgency theory, the population is the center of gravity. You are basically not fighting to capture this or that hill. You're really fighting to obtain the support, or at least the control of the population, because it's the population that gives you what you need to overcome the other side. If the counterinsurgents have enough loyalty in the population will inform the counterinsurgents where that hidden base is. If the insurgents get enough support from the population will man and equip their army to give them the firepower the insurgents need to resist the government. And so we should expect population loyalty to show up in both of these games. So in Star Wars Rebellion, indeed we do. The planets are going to be marked dynamically, because you can change this as players, for either loyalty to the rebels or loyalty to the Imperials, or possibly they're just being repressed. It's possible to have a 3rd status I didn't show here, or perhaps there's some planets where there just isn't that much population anyway, so you don't really track it. And this loyalty is very important for both of those aspects of overcoming the other side's advantage, because loyal planets, loyal populations produce forces for you. And if the Imperials get loyalty over a population of a planet, that planet, the rebel player has to tell the galactic player, the Galactic Empire player, whether or not the rebel base is there. So if you get enough Imperial loyalty around the galaxy, you're going to have the information you need along with your probe droids to know where the rebel base is. And then a lot of the missions that the characters will undertake in the game, as showed by some of these sample cards here, have to do with winning the loyalty of the population of the galaxy over to your side. Same goes in a actually quite similar way in Fire in the Lake about Vietnam. Each city and each province is going to be marked for what forces control it, because that influences who can build support, and whether that population is in support of the government or in opposition to the government, meaning supporting the rebels. And not only does this do these dynamics of the human terrain, the political terrain of Vietnam affect gameplay, there are also victory conditions. The US is trying to convince the population to support the government in Saigon. The communists are trying to convince the population to oppose it. And we have a number of event cards in the game that, of course, affect that contest for the hearts and minds of the population in Vietnam. So that's it for a little sampling of these 6 games and how they show the system dynamics of the worlds they're portraying in their gameplay and in their game rules to transport us there. I just want to show quickly, I'll leave it up. If you're interested in this kind of thing, a number of other examples. I have played many of these games, but I'll admit I have not played all of them, so I'm not necessarily recommending them, but they are all examples of how both fictional and historical representations in board games can take us into many different aspects of real life human affairs. And so with that, I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, and questions. And shall I stop streaming or just leave this up?
Oh, you can leave it up and we can just chat for a little bit if you like. Got some time. That was a wonderful talk. That was really enlightening.
Muted myself. I will say I think it's striking how a lot of the modern AAA, I guess you could say, war games digitally just kind of take these concepts and merge them together into something that works together. But it's interesting to see how the board games that really kind of started putting these concepts to paper really focus in on mainly those aspects, like Dune, really with the economic control of land.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's so, I've done a lot of engaging and thinking about what are the relative merits, the strengths and weaknesses of different media for getting at these kinds of models and different game media. And they all have advantages. And of course, computer games have tremendous advantages in being able to draw on a huge amount of data at a very granular level and do the computations with that data to give us a lot of detail right in the model. And that's fantastic because board games, of course, sharply focus us to simplify because we just don't want to be, doing all these, calculations and record keeping as we play our game. It just wouldn't be fun or doable. But that's also a handicap for computer games because all of that is happening in the code. And it's not very accessible or even accessible at all to the players, depending on the user interface and the degree of expertise the players have in going into code and modifying it for their computer game. So sometimes you don't quite understand why the model produced a result that it did exactly. You're kind of guessing because the computer code is a black box. It's a barrier to understanding the model. And there's another aspect to that, and that is that the board game design, and particularly commercial board game design and mainstream commercial board game design, like these science fiction and fantasy games we've talked about today, and also classroom board game design, it's a forcing function on the designer. You have to really simplify. And when you have to simplify dynamics of a world you're trying to show people about, you have to decide what's really important. And so board games are good at taking at least a designer, at least one person's view of what is it really important to understand about the battle for the surface of Arrakis. What matters here, and what are details in the novel that are charming but less necessary to take us into that world. And that's helpful. It's clarifying, right? Now this is the thing, you can, because you're playing the board game yourself and you know the rules, and you've perhaps read the book or seen the movie or whatever, you can critique that, and you can say, well, this designer really overplayed the role of spice, in buying treasure card or whatever. This player made the spacing guild, too powerful in terms of its ability to extract resources from those fighting for the surface of whatever, or left out something, right? So we want to do that as players, right? We want to think about the representation in these war games, and compare them to how we think the actual world or the fictional world really works. And board games enable us to do that because the model is so accessible. And we can start from that simplified version that the designer has had to simplify purposefully for us, to think about, well, is this what's really important?
Yeah, that was something for me when I sat down with my first coin game. Sorry, I forget the name of it. The one about the Finnish Civil War that came out relatively recently.
All Bridges Burning by
Yes, that's the one.
By VPJ Arponen.
Wonderful game. And for me, it was one of the first games, because again, we do on our channel, we do a lot of digital war games. We're trying to do more of the board war games, but that was the first one where I got to sit down, read through the rulebook, read through the accompanying materials, and then play the game. And to me, that was the same experience as reading a history, like an academic history of, okay, here is their take on the historiography of this conflict, and they're telling me how they believe this conflict played out and what was key and what was less key. And I thought that was a wonderfully intimate experience of, okay, this is how this person understands this war. So now this is going to be influencing how I understand this war and how I can engage other sources that deal with this war.
And I experienced the same thing. And another, to me, really potent aspect of that in a game is that it's very good at exploring what might have happened but didn't, right? And if we think about great historical examination, great works of history, it shouldn't just be a narrative. It shouldn't just be, well, this happened, then that happened, then that happened. Because at the time that it's happening, it's not that. It's the time that it's happening, it's all kinds of possibilities and uncertainty, and the actors involved don't know what's going to happen next. And they are behaving on the basis of that uncertainty. That's what life is like. And if we want to understand history and historical conflicts, for example, we should be trying to understand how did it work at the time, and uncertainty is in it. And it's very, very hard to convey that view in a book. But in a game, Vesa Arponen for the Finnish Civil War has to tell you in the game what he thinks is plausible as an alternative way for it to play out, right? He's giving you the bounds of what he thinks is plausible by giving you the mechanisms and then giving you agency as a player to operate those mechanisms how you see fit, given the incentives he's giving you. and that's so much richer for 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 what we can call speculative history. For um, what are the plausible bounds of what might have occurred?
Because counterfactual narratives exist, but they're very fraught. Because it's easy for someone to just, if they're not bound by systems
Mm-hmm.
that, like, saying this is how we're laying out our understanding of the foundation of how these different things could impact what happened,
Mm-hmm.
it can get out of hand. So I think the
And
idea that
and
you're looking at it through a
yeah.
game,
And if
yeah,
it's a work of alternative history, a book, again, it's the author who has chosen what happens
Mhm.
without, and maybe the author is conveying to you what the bounds were, how things tied together that might have made this happen and so forth. But in the game, it's up to you within those bounds, right? You're experiencing those bounds. And I think therefore it's much more intimate, as you said, and it's just much more powerful in considering, okay, so how did this machine run back then?
Hmm. See, this talk has really made me think that I am not limited to historical games when it comes to conveying these things to, say, a class of people who may not, like, if I'm teaching I teach modern, but if I were teaching a medieval history class, I would not feel so odd breaking out the Game of Thrones board game to talk about diplomacy
Yes.
and say, all right, you all watch Game of Thrones, everyone knows what this is. We're gonna, one class this semester, we're gonna sit down and play a giant game of Game of Thrones and work out how these, you know, interfactional diplomatic back and forths are gonna go.
Yeah, absolutely, because that world is, of course, based on some real world history,
Mhm.
and loosely based, but it's drawing principles from times like the War of the Roses, and and therefore so is the game. And you're going to be asking your students, okay, so what in the game that we just played reminds you of real world history, or
Mhm.
reminds you of the world that's really out there, and what's different?
I think that'll be a wonderful thing to try and convince the higher ups to let me do.
Well, there is sometimes resistance in academic institutions, in government, and elsewhere, because of this idea that, well, games are trivial, right? It's play for fun, and it's not real education. But in fact, I think they're just a very powerful medium, and yes, for engaging students, absolutely, but more importantly, for conveying complex adaptive system dynamics. I mean, if that's what you're trying to teach, that's a very hard thing to teach, but it's everywhere in life. And so we need to teach it. And
Mhm.
I can't think of a better way than playing a game.
Hmm. Well, do you have any last questions, Jack? Because we can wrap up nicely at 10:30 here and not worry about it.
Um, no, I mean, like, you've answered so many of my questions. It was a very thorough talk, and I think that our listeners here, our listeners and watchers, uh, got a lot out of this. From what I heard from folks, they were like saying, like, yeah, you nailed it. So,
Yeah. It
um,
seems we didn't have too many questions, but a lot of the watch count went up and down throughout. But it seems like we had a lot of people tuning in just to listen, which was nice.
mhm. Yeah, I think that that's a good point there. Sorry again for the brief technical interruptions, but um, thank you everyone who tuned in today for the Paper Time Machines talk. This was a lot of fun, and how would you like to sign off here? Do we want to do some plugs? I guess for Volko, I would say go check out GMT Games. Those games there,
What are your
specifically,
latest couple designs that you want to
I would say
anything
these
on
three: Falling
P500?
Sky, Nevsky, Fire in the Lake. Anything else you would like to mention specifically?
Well, Nevsky is the first in a series, Levian campaign. The second one, Almoravid, takes place, as I think you guys know, in medieval Spain,
Mm-hmm.
Reconquista, and that's going to be coming out, I hope, later this year. Um, And the coin series, which both Falling Sky and Fire in the Lake are a part, is going strong at gmtgames.com. You can see the next several volumes coming. For each of those, by the way, the Levy and Campaign series and the coin series, there are open Discord servers that you can peek in on and just see what folks are doing in terms of modifying, testing, designing new games in both of those series.
I can vouch for the how interesting the coin Discord is. There's a lot of wonderful discussions and people making their own games and talking about the history behind the games and trying to make it. It's wonderful. So anyone who wants to go should definitely check out the coin. We can put
We'll throw
links
it
to
up
these things.
on Twitter, I think, probably.
Yeah, we can do that. But yeah, if there's no final question from anyone watching, then yeah, thank you so much for coming to listen, and thank you, Volko, for speaking and dealing with tech issues and answering Jack and my questions. We really appreciate you coming to Let's Talk About Wargames.
Thanks both, and thanks all for letting me spend this time with you.
All right, thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you. Take care.